In today's video, I'll be going over the setup of this brand new PSE Omen. I ordered this from the local pro shop back in March, finally came in June, and I'll go through the whole setup process. This is actually now the only compound I own. All the other bows that I still have are traditional bows. First thing I want to check is the cam timing, and it looks like they are perfectly synced up here based on those timing marks right out of the box, which is nice. I'll go ahead and attach this COR mount from the Hamskea Epsilon rest and put a little blue Loctite on there just to make sure that things don't come undone. This option is only available with bows that have the integrate built into it. At this point, it's pretty easy to go ahead and just adjust the rest. I'll leave the cord hanging for the time being. And then I'll go ahead and stick the sight on. It's not critical at this point. I'm not going to use it for a while, but this bow does have a Picatinny mount, so I had to get that adapter for my black gold. Now, I know for sure that I'm not going to shoot this bow at 90% let off. I'll probably play around with 80 and 85% to see what I ultimately end up liking better. But for sure, I'll take it off at 90. And for starters here, I'll stick it on the 85% position, which is the middle hole in that draw stop. And then I'll go ahead also and adjust the draw length. So it came stock at, I believe, 29 inches, and I'm just moving it one slot over to get it to 29.5 inches. If I need to adjust it based on the feel of the bow and the axle to axle, I can, but this will be a good starting point. And then I'll go ahead and set the bow level in my bow vise. For setting up the rest initially, I'm putting it 13/16 of an inch out from the riser. And then for the height, I actually had to play around with this a little bit because if I ran the arrow through the center of the burger holes, the rest would smash the shelf with its stock limit screws. But if I run it high in the burger hole, it wasn't quite as bad. So that's what I'm starting with right now. I have the arrow running a little bit higher in the burger hole, which is fine, and it's not a bad starting point. I'll mark it at perfectly level 90 degrees off the string, which is why I needed that string to be level. And then I'll just take a marker and mark where I'm going to tie my soft knots for my D-loop. I'm going to go ahead at this point also and put on the little sticky rubber piece for my rest. And then I'll take that cord from the Epsilon rest, make sure that rubber piece is enough out of the way that I can tie my knot, and then I'll go ahead and tie a D-loop knot here. Since I basically took this right off my Matthews, I didn't really have a whole lot of room to work with to tie that knot, so it's a little bit difficult, but it's just a D-loop knot, very similar to the one that I'll show when I actually tie my D-loop. And then once that knot is tied, I have to take that little rubber piece and just shimmy it down until it gets close to the limb itself. And that reduces the amount that it's actually shaking around when you shoot. Now, one thing I do want to check before I tie on my D-loop is nock fit, because these are likely the nocks that I'll be shooting, the Nocturnal and the Gold Tip nock. Measurement-wise, they're almost identical on all the key dimensions, which is great. That makes them very interchangeable. But I want to make sure that, number one, I'm not getting too much slop or too much tension, and that it pops off the string with a reasonable amount of force. And luckily, this center shearving seems to be good in both regards, so I'm not going to have to reserve it. Some people would choose to reserve at this point regardless, just because they don't necessarily trust the factory center shearvings. Some people will go ahead and install a new string, but I don't necessarily see the need, at least at this point. Now, I'm going to use a nylon material as well as beeswax to tie my soft knots. This is something I saw MFJJ doing on a video, and I thought I'd try it. I've never tried it with this material before. I'll tie a series of overhand knots above and below the string, just 2 or 3 of them here on the top side of the nock, and then cut and use the lighter to get those nice and flush. I'll put my nock in place to tie the lower portion, and I'll use the same material, but on this lower portion, I'm not going to leave much of a gap for the nock itself, and I'll tie that series of overhand knots above and below the string in a length that's at least twice as long as the top. In fact, in my Matthews, I had done it where I didn't have a soft nock on the top at all, and that seemed to work fine as well. This is just another way of doing it. This is actually the way that I saw Tim Gillingham do it on one of his Instagram stories, so I figured I'd try it. And then for this D-loop material, this is the softer D-loop material. I'll go ahead and get it nice and frayed so that I can use the lighter to create a good mushroom so that it won't pull out of the knot. And then if you know your exact length already, you can pre-cut this to length. I don't, so what I'm going to do is leave a nice long piece to work with. And the orientation of this does matter. So as a lefty with the top of the bow facing the left side of the screen, this is how I would hold a handheld release. And so I want to have the D-loop tied in this manner so that it minimizes the amount of torque that a handheld release would put on that D-loop. you can see if I put it the other way and then snap on that same handheld release, there's a little bit more twist that develops when operating that handheld release. And of course it gets more and more exaggerated as the D-loop is shorter and shorter. So I'll go ahead and start this D-loop knot, and this is a super common knot. There's tons of tutorials as well as photos to give you a good visual reference of how to tie this knot. This is what it looks like ultimately. And I'll go ahead and cinch that up and get it right up next to that soft knock, and then I'll go ahead and take pliers and get it nice and tight. I want to be a little bit careful with the pliers because if you hold them on kind of the edge of a pliers that has a really grooved surface, you can actually start to nick your D-loop material. And then that can propagate over time into a D-loop that ends up not looking too great. And then I'll go ahead and flip the tag end around to the other side of the string to tie the D-loop knot as well on that side. And really the trick here is knowing where to cut and how long to make that D-loop. And it'll gain a lot of length when you go to really pull it tight. So what I like to do is get a lot of this slack pulled out and get that D-loop down to where it's very small, to where I can just barely get the D-loop pliers in there, and then that gives me a little bit of extra room to where I know I can cut and then burn the end and then still get it to stretch to a nice, say 3/4 of an inch or so D-loop. So that's about where I'll start, and then I'll trim it, and you can see I'm not trimming it right tight to the edge. I'm leaving enough excess here to where I can still fray that end and then use a lighter just like on the initial side to get a nice big full mushroom to help prevent that side of the knot from pulling through the D-loop. And if I think I have a lot of excess here too, I'll just let that burn and let that take up a little bit of extra length to get it nice and pretty close to the knot itself. So now you can see when I take these D-loop pliers and I go ahead and stretch that knot out and get everything nice and tight, I end up with about a 3/4 of an inch D-loop, which is about where I typically would have mine. One thing I'll do here as well is I'll set the cable rod in a little bit to relieve a little bit of the stresses off the cables, but still allow me just enough clearance to where I still have a good margin of error, maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch or so of clearance with that lower left vane. Now it's time for me to go ahead and put in the peep sight. This is a 7/32 size peep sight from Total Peep. It's a really big peep, but it does a great job at blocking out excess light. And I have this peep size so that when I'm at full draw, I use the bigger 2-inch sight housing on my black gold, and that 7/32 size aperture seems to fit pretty well with that sight housing in bright daylight. And there's a little bit of a gap as the light gets lower, but that's going to happen with any peep and sight setup. Now the string comes with this knot initially put into it, this little piece of serving, and I'm not going to remove that entirely. Certainly I'll use it to spread the string apart to put that peep in, but I'm actually going to shorten that up and leave it in the string so that I always know where the exact center of the string is. And then if it's not obvious already, I do have the bow in a bow press right now, taking enough tension off that string to where I can spread the string apart far enough to actually get the peep in. Now I'm taking another piece of serving thread. This is just like some power grip material that I have, and I'm tying a constrictor knot. This is not going to be a permanent knot for the peep, but it will prevent it from sliding super easily. It'll kind of keep it snug to where when I'm doing my test shooting, it's not flying out of the string, and I can move it by sliding it without too much effort. And I'll leave it in this position until I get the bow a little bit more shot in, do some test shots, figure out my stabilizer setup, and figure out where that exact peep height needs to be, and then I'll go ahead and tie it in more permanently than this. So I'm just getting this one as a temporary piece. I'll trim the ends somewhat close, tie off the ends, and then I'm ready to start shooting the bow. I'll go ahead and put the stabilizer on here. I have the Titanium Archery Products stabilizers, and I'm starting here with just 3 ounces on the back. And I used a bee stinger connector instead of the one that came stock. And then I picked up these Go Sticks from Hoyt because I wanted the option to have some type of a bow stand. And it comes with a couple different components. One is basically like a QD mount that I'll go ahead and bolt into the bottom stabilizer mounting hole on that riser. And then I can go ahead and stick in my other stabilizer, which also is a Titanium Archery Products bar, and I put 2 ounces on that, and I capped it off with the little mini stabilizer that actually shipped with the bow. And then those little sticks can actually just screw into the QD. And one thing I noticed is that the way that this bow is set up, you can actually keep the cam off the ground and have it rest like that. Or you can have it tilted back to where the cam is resting on the ground. At this point, I'm just doing some shots, quite a bit actually off screen, to make sure, number one, that the peep height is correct. Number two, that the stabilizers are initially set up to where the bow isn't jumping too hard in any direction. And I'm just doing some fun speed tests with hunting arrows at this point as well. Playing around with the draw weight, seeing what's comfortable and what's not. Now that I know where that peep is going to be, it's time to tie it in more permanently. So I'm doing probably one of the more well-known and used peep sight tying methods. So I'll go ahead and serve in the start. This is the same nylon cord with that beeswax. After doing that initial serving to tie it in, I wrap it up one side of the peep. And with this size gap, it took me around 10 or 11 wraps. And then on that 11th wrap, I went ahead and actually just kind of stretched it in and snugged it into the peep itself underneath that string. And that tension helps hold everything in place. Then you kind of take your hands off a little bit. And then I can wrap 3 wraps around the peep itself in the center in that groove, get it nice and tight. And then I actually go back down the other side, which again, this is a very common method. I've seen tons of people do it this way. I had tried it as well with the method that Bomar showed on his channel with all of the half hitches, and that is a really rock solid method of tying them in as well. But it's a nightmare when you need to either move your peep, or if you need to, swap out to a different peep, or you want to swap your peep to a different bow. It's just a nightmare to try and remove. And then one thing you can probably also notice throughout this peep tying process is that the direction that I'm going with all of these wraps is the same direction as the twist of the string. Now, once I get the wraps down the other side of that groove, I'll check just to make sure that I'm equal distance on top and bottom of the peep before I tie in my finish. And for that finish, it's basically 5 or 6 really tight wraps, and then I do a back serve, which is the same way that you would finish off any kind of a serving job. If you're replacing the setter serving, for instance, where you just go through and make a loop, wrap backwards, same direction. I think I did around 7 wraps on this one. Once you get it down to where you just have a single loop, you can go ahead and snug that all the way with that tag end. Get it nice and tight, and then trim and burn the ends. And as always, when you're trimming and burning the ends, ensure to keep the lighter above the string because heat rises. You don't want to obviously do damage to your string. And then we can also notice here as well is that my peep is a little bit crooked now after I tied that in. So I will need to adjust the string twist just slightly to pull that back into alignment. So since the bow's already in the press, I'll go ahead and take the tension off, and then I take the string off, and just a half a turn in the bottom cam was just enough to get that peep right back into center line. And I would estimate at this point I probably have maybe 75 shots through the bow, and I can move on to tuning. So first shot, I have a knock right tear. Now there's a number of ways you can fix it. The probably preferred way to do it on these PSEs is their new Easy 220 system. It's a cam shimming system, but you don't have to remove the axle. They have these little spacer clips that they have a tool where you can pop them in and pop them out. You do have to put it in a bow press and take a little bit of tension off, so that's maybe one detractor, but this is way better than pulling your whole axle out, and I even think it's easier than adjusting yokes. So I'll go ahead and take the tool and just pop out those little clips on either side, those little spacers. The spacers are numbered, and they come stock, at least mine did, with a 120 on the left and a 100 on the right. I'm starting with the bottom cam here because the bottom cam, the way it was leaned, seemed to have it a little bit closer to contacting that cable, so I wanted to try this one first. I'm replacing these with the next set of shims, which is a 140 and an 80. So a little bit less space on the right, a little bit fatter spacer on the left to move that cam over to the right, move that cam the same direction as the tear. So I'm taking another follow-up shot here, and you can tell that it really did a good job of quickly cleaning up that left and right tear. But now I do have a little bit of a knock low tear, so I did 2 shots here just to get a replicate. And you can tell when I zoom in that even though that left and right is more cleaned up, they all have a little bit of a knock low tear. Now, I was able to fix it by moving the rest down, but I had a very downward angle with that arrow. I mean, the arrow was basically going through the center of the burger holes with a high knock point. You can do it that way. I did some more research and I found that a lot of guys run their PSEs with the rest super high above the burger hole. So that's what I tried here. I moved that rest to where the bottom of the arrow is maybe in the top third of the burger hole, and that got me nice and clean at 90 degrees from the string. So that's a really good starting point. And this way that rest has a ton of clearance. I do have a little bit of knock right still that came after I adjusted that rest. So I swapped out the top shim and now it's running perfectly center. Now it's time to level the sight that the bow is tuned. So once again, I put it in the vise, get the string nice and level with that Hamskea tool. And then I put the Hamskea tool on the sight to try and level the first axis. I figured out that I didn't have enough travel, I couldn't get it level. So I had to take the sight off this bracket and readjust the bracket itself in order to get a better starting point. So I just cracked the screws loose here, adjusted that. I'm holding it in tension one direction, locking the screws back down. Then I can put the sight back on to retest that first axis adjustment. And you can tell that now I have the amount of play that I need, and now I'm able to get that bubble nice and level. So now I know that that's totally level with the string. Now I can adjust my second axis. It's not off by much, just a tiny, tiny little bit. But how I would adjust that second axis is, with the first axis still sitting level, I crack loose those two screws and just look at the level on the sight housing itself, and I want those two to be totally equal. Once they are equal, I can tighten those two screws for the sight rein back down, and then just make sure that they have stayed level throughout that process. Sometimes they look level when they're loose, and then you tighten it back down and they shift a little bit. So it takes a little bit of playing around, but overall, not too challenging. All right, I got the Hamskea third axis tool, the Gen 2 version. It has this little threaded rod that goes through it, and I'm gonna line the top and bottom points of that on this plumb line that I have here, and then I'll go ahead and double check where my sight level is at. Ideally, I want to be able to line that thing up on that plumb line. When it's straight, have the bow nice and level on the sight, and then be able to aim down also on that plumb line and still have that sight be perfectly level. I'm level here. I'll aim down to see if there's any difference. And it does look like it's changed. So it was centered and then it moved over to the left. So I'm gonna have to adjust my third axis on my sight. I'll go ahead and unlock the lock screw for the third axis. Now I can go ahead and adjust with this screw in the back side. I'll go counterclockwise about 1/8 of a turn, and I'll leave this unlocked and just check to see how that looks. All right. I'll say, if anything, that seemed like it was maybe a touch worse. So I'm going to go ahead and twist it 1/8 of a turn clockwise to get back to where I was, and then another 1/8 of a turn clockwise. Touch better, I think. Try a little bit more. It's about another 1/8 of a turn. That was very, very close. Just a touch more clockwise, and I think we'll be there. That was like hardly 1/8 of a turn, but that might be enough. Level it, level. There we go. That's level, so I'll go ahead and tighten that set screw back down, and then all three axes will be leveled. Set screws tightened. Leveling tool off. So now at this point, the bow is all set up, tuned, sights leveled, ready to sight it in. And in addition, since I filmed that video, I received in the Titanium Archery Products PSE upgrade kit, which includes a new cable rod with a slide, a string stop, as well as new titanium draw stops. So I'll do another video on that, and then eventually a full review on this bow.